What are you making of the oil complex? What are you making about just seeing a little bit of a breather being taken by oil investors as they wait for the Fed, probably? But is it a breather, which would assume that we continue on the upward trajectory, or is it actually perhaps a turning point?
No, I think it's natural to see these little pullbacks, and in fact they can develop into something a bit lengthier than one trading session. When you look at the fundamentals, though, it does suggest that this tightness is going to persist, and I think until investor positioning in particular, I suppose, reflects that we're going to see further gains in oil prices. Certainly, that's our expectations. I think through the first half of this year, there was a lot of focus on the macro backdrop, and that was fairly bearish considering the tighter monetary policies that we're seeing by central banks and in China, where that recovery just wasn't growing to the extent that people had expected at the start of the year. But we've seen that slowly adjust, and I think now, obviously, with a pause potentially in play on that. On those interest rates, China looking relatively okay. This is building to being more than just a supply-driven rally. I do feel that the demand side, at least our expectations around it, the market's expectations are improving, and so that's going to aid further gains, I suppose, in oil prices through the remainder of this year.
How much of this oil rally is due to demand, I wonder? I mean, obviously China remarkably has shown some pretty resilient demand, and certainly starting to pick up. Do you think that's sustainable for the rest of the year, Daniel?
Yeah, no, I do think so. I think we're seeing real tightness in pockets of the market, particularly in diesel, where there's been even greater supply side issues. So the consumers are really grappling for any available cargoes in the market. Coming up to a key period for the industry. The holiday season. The increase of manufacturing activity you tend to see in the lead up to December. So it's going to be a demand-driven market just as much as it is supply. And as I said, I think those expectations still haven't really adjusted to the reality that we've been seeing, I think, for most of this year. That demand has been okay. It hasn't been shooting the lights out, and I think maybe expectations were too high at the start of the year. But really solid growth from the US. And pretty good growth out of China as well. So I think it's clearly both sides of the market playing to that price support at the moment.
And to follow up on that, Daniel, David here, by the way. So this latest leg higher in oil prices arguably was triggered by that forecast from OPEC Plus. I think the tightest supply in 10+ years. So in other words, can I trust that number? I mean, is that number worst case, given that you think demand is going to pick up?
Yeah, well, I mean, clearly Saudi Arabia and the broader OPEC group are sitting there in the background waiting for market fundamentals to stabilise. Saudi itself has 3 million barrels a day of spare capacity just sitting there. So there is a level of cautiousness within the market that this could switch quite quickly. But those comments, obviously, by the oil minister that there's still some risks around Chinese demand, probably intimate that they want to make sure that that growth is continuing before they do ease back on those restrictions. And I think that's worried the physical buyers in the market that they can't wait until November, December, to really pick up these cargoes. They have to do it as soon as possible. So, that's I think the real impetus that we're seeing permeate through the market at the moment.
Yeah, Daniel, I'm going to try to help out some colleagues who are probably going to cut this video clip for the web. Do you think we get to $100 in Brent?
Yeah, I certainly think that's on the cards. I mean, we had a target for the end of the year of $100 a barrel, and I suspect that's going to be beaten. The momentum is very strong at the moment. OPEC seems to be determined, to reiterate its oil policy, and as I said, demand is looking pretty robust. So if we do see the Fed pause, some other central banks pause, I think it'll give impetus for that push through the triple figure level.